the last 20 years, Survival has made over 400 television programs, and there are at least 400 more we'd like to make. Our aims have always been the same: to entertain people by showing the wonderful world of nature all around us, and more importantly, to show why we should save as much of it as we can, in our own interests as well as that of wildlife. Let's start by looking at a typical survival story. It's called Orangutan, Orphans of the Forest. Dieter Plager, one of Survival's leading wildlife cameramen, tells us why we consider this film to be so important.
I felt so very strongly about making an orangutan film because it does not only depict the future of the orangutan, but also the future of the rainforests, which are one of the most complex and most important ecological systems in the world. The destruction of rainforest is going on at an alarming rate. In fact, it's something like 40 acres every minute. So by the time you have finished listening to this tape, 8,000 acres of rainforest will have been felled. Rainforests are terribly, terribly important because they provide water for all the little farms, for all the little rice paddies, and so it's in people's own interest to keep the rainforest. The orangutan is one of the victims of the destruction of rainforest. Because especially baby orangutans are such lovely, appealing little creatures, people keep them as pets. This is all very well when they're small and nice and cuddly, but when they get bigger, they become out of control. So they are now being transferred to a rehabilitation center, which is run by the World Wildlife Fund and the Frankfurt Zoological Society. By teaching and training them to become wild orangutans again, they are automatically adding to the declining natural population.
In filming most survival stories, there are special difficulties to be overcome. The rainforest causes the cameraman a number of unexpected problems.
It is so hot and humid that mold grows over and inside the camera lenses, and if you're not very careful, you actually get out of focus pictures. Also, another problem in the forest are the leeches. When you go somewhere, you go along a path or so, you suddenly find leeches homing in on you from all sides. And when finally you come back to your station, you find that you have about 25 or 30 leeches in each shoe, making your boots full of blood. It keeps on bleeding for about 2.5 hours. So if you want to go to bed, you have to stick your feet out the bed and let the blood drip off for 2.5 hours before you can start sleeping. And just when you lie there and you try to sleep, then hordes of mosquitoes swarm upon you and feed on the blood, so that's not a very pleasant situation.
A tremendous amount of planning takes place before filming can begin, especially if you expect to be marooned in the Arctic tundra for 6 months. Here's what happened to Des and Jen Bartlett when they filmed The Flight of the Snow Geese.
You land on a float plane on the snow, and this means that you can't get out until the Hudson Bay itself thaws and you can get out by canoe. It's permafrost all the time, so you can't drive a tent peg into the ground. It's all frozen. It's like trying to drive a tent peg into a block of ice, only it's even more solid because there's stones set in. If you've been cleaning your teeth and you put the damp glass down onto a rock, when you go to pick it up, it's frozen to the rock. The temperature's 30 or 40 below zero. One night, Jen woke me up at about 1:45 in the morning. A polar bear was trying to get into the tent. It was moving along inside the guy rat, brushing against the tent, and as we sleep on the ground, you look up above you and see its silhouette on the side of the tent with the moonlight. Not having guns or any means of protection, the only way you can try and frighten it away is to shout. It tore the fabric, just the weight of it, but luckily it didn't use its claws to break in. If you're filming wildlife, you try and avoid carrying arms because you should know enough about it to get out of difficult situations. In Africa, lions and elephants and rhinos are not much of a problem in the camp, but in the tundra, the polar bear can be more of a menace because they're extremely aggressive, they're much, much more powerful than a dozen men can be, and they're not frightened.
The highlight of this film was an incredible close-up flying sequence of snow geese. How is it done? Des Bartlett is now prepared to give the secret away.
Many tundra nesting birds all hatch out at the same time. All the chicks are in contact inside the egg, so that they usually all come out within the 1 day. Any egg left behind when the others have moved away would be sure to be eaten by predators, so we'd collect the young chick as soon as it hatched. Before too long, we'd had about a dozen or 14 of these young goslings, which very soon became part of our family and thought they were humans, I think, rather than geese, because they were living with us, travelling with us. So to get them flying, we'd sit on the tailgate of a station wagon, and our nephew Les would drive at 45 miles an hour, and the geese could maintain their position with us as their leader, so that they'd be out in formation to the side and very close to us. And this enabled us to get extreme close-ups of them flying using a wide-angle lens. It was as if the camera was up in the sky with the geese flying out to the side.
All survival wildlife cameramen and women have to be first-class practical naturalists. They must understand their subject and devise ways of filming it so that it behaves entirely naturally. It must never be disturbed or frightened, especially if the animal is very rare and has never been filmed before. Cindy Buxton worked alone for 10 months in a remote swamp in Africa while filming the Shoebill stork.
No one actually knows why its beak is that shape. They are very rare birds. There are only 3 countries in the world that you can find the Shoebill: Sudan, Zaire and Zambia. The place that you find them in Zambia is an enormous swamp called the Bangwelu swamps. In this 7,000 square mile swamp, there are probably no more than a couple of thousand shoebills. And I lived on a small island in the middle of the swamps. Once I had chosen the pair that I was going to film, right from start to finish, obviously I went to them every day. The first day I didn't go very near them, and the next day a little bit nearer, next day a bit nearer. And it was amazing. They just totally accepted me. I think after a couple of months I was just sort of part of the scenery. The male never came nearer than about 10 feet to me, but the female would come right up close to me, and I could virtually put my hand out and touch her. The chick had seen me from the moment the little bird could open its eyes, and I was just another papyrus stalk, I think, to him. The chick, when it hatched, never moved 1 inch in its nest until it was 5 months old. And, of course, no one knew this. Even I began to think that maybe there was something wrong with the bird. Perhaps I ought to give it some vitamins or something to help it. One day I went to the nest, and I was absolutely horrified when I got there and found no bird. You know, and I thought for some ghastly moment that a crocodile would take me or something like this. And I got out of the canoe and started wading around the swamps and looking in the little reed beds. And I found it only about 6 feet away from the nest, but it had actually moved 6 feet, which was frightfully exciting. From then on, it began to wander around, but it was at least another 2 months before it was able to fly. I fell into a bog one day and sank, you know, in one of those bogs where you just sink forever and disappear. And I remember while I was sinking, I hope it's not 6 foot deep, because I'm only 5'4", and no one will ever see me again. But I didn't. I stopped when the water got shoulder high. And I eventually pulled myself out. This sort of mud and, it was terrible. One night there was a fantastic gale in the swamps, and the hut I was living in collapsed, and the walls just fell in. And I was just lying on the floor in my camp bed, soaked to the skin, and all I could think of doing was getting up and rescuing the film and finding a tarpaulin to cover it. It didn't really seem to matter about anything else, but it was just the film and the cameras. It can be lonely filming. The times that perhaps one does get lonely is in the evening, when you get back and one's obviously tired, and it would be nice to talk to someone about what you've been up to. Particularly, I think, when you've had either a very good day or a disastrous day. You dropped your camera in the swamp and lost 1,000 feet of film. The burden would be halved if only you had somebody to talk to and share it with. But the next best thing I found was to write about it, and so I used to write a lot in the evening.
Fieldcraft, as used by Cindy, is essential for all wildlife filming. Sometimes, though, the cameraman has to be highly ingenious if he's to capture a particularly difficult scene.
I've always tried to get unusual camera angles. When we wanted to make a film of a fish eagle in the Okavango swamps, I asked my brother, who's a model plane enthusiast, to build an aircraft which could carry, say, a 6-pound camera. In the beginning, there were many crashes. He literally had to reconstruct the plane on location, but finally we then managed to launch it from the top of a boat. And he then steered it by remote control, and eventually it got very close to fish eagles. But it was very difficult because the noise of the motor chased the eagles away, and they were a little bit panicky at first. But nevertheless, I think we got some very unusual angles of fish eagles in flight. Of course, one thing is always very difficult to get close to birds, and this very same problem I had in Ethiopia whilst making a film about pelicans. Up to that point, I had filmed everything from one hide. The pelicans were extremely shy, and whenever I tried to erect a new hide at a different angle, they would immediately desert the area. So one day when I was in Addis Ababa, I visited the museum, and I saw a stuffed pelican with his neck broken off. So the museum's director said, "Sure, you can have it." So I gave him a donation for the museum. I then took the pelican home and I hollowed it out. I put the camera, my head and a battery inside and was ready to film pelicans from water level. I swam round the corner of the island towards the pelican colony and joined all the other pelicans. And then suddenly I realized that they were coming so close to me, they brushed wings with me, they landed next to me, and it was such an incredible feeling of exhilaration, almost like being one of them. And I was almost in tears when they just came so close and thought I was actually a pelican. And I think it was one of the most emotional moments in my life.
Sometimes we can only film an animal by using special devices. For example, if we want to get the camera in the middle of a herd of elephants, we often hide it in a dummy tortoise and operate it by remote control. Other animals, such as tigers, are only active by night, and so we use an image intensifier which films them just by the light of the stars. Oxford Scientific Films are experts in filming the seemingly impossible. They design and build all their own equipment. Dr. John Cook tells you about it.
Well, one of the most interesting and certainly the most complex piece of equipment that we have built is the Cosmoscope and Cosmoglide. This is a system for filming very, very close to the ground. It's really an inverted periscope system, and it can go from a wide-angle shot right into high magnification. You can get the head of an ant filling the frame. The whole periscope system is mounted on a very complicated gantry system which allows the camera to move with complete freedom anywhere in space. We've been approached quite a lot in recent years to do effects filming, particularly for science fiction movies, things like Superman, Saturn III, The Alien, and films of this sort. Another area in which we have specialized particularly is in the filming of very small creatures. And this we've done by dark field illumination, which allows us to photograph very small translucent objects, particularly things like water fleas or plankton, things that live in the sea. It makes that object glow like a star against a dark sky. And in it you can see a mass of detail, all the muscle fibers and the fine hairs and filaments and so on. It makes a very dramatic picture. One of my favorite subjects happens to be spiders, and we were lucky enough to persuade Survival to do a 1-hour special on spider biology a few years ago. It involved filming the tarantula. This is the big, hairy, ground-living spider that has such a bad reputation. Everyone is convinced that it's terribly deadly. In actual fact, this is a totally undeserved reputation. It's really quite a friendly creature, makes a very good pet. In fact, my children handle them quite happily, without any fear.
Well, tarantulas may be harmless, but tigers and gorillas can be extremely dangerous. Often, when the unexpected happens, the only thing a cameraman can do is to carry on filming.
One day, my wife and myself, we were sitting in a little hide made out of grass in Nepal. We had the camera set up, the image intensifier was set up, and the moon was coming up. And suddenly I noticed a very slight movement in the grass. The tiger came out of the grass, and I immediately switched on the image intensifier, focused on the tiger, started filming, and immediately the tiger looked at us. And he came closer, and my heart started beating. My wife, too, her arms were sort of clutching into my arm. She was very terrified, and I was very worried, too. And he came closer and closer, and I kept focusing. He snarled, and he stopped about 10 feet from the hide, and he looked right into our eyes, and he snarled again, and then suddenly he darted off into the grass, and we just breathed a big sigh of relief. One of the most exciting moments I can remember is when we were in Zaire with Adrian de Schrijver, the warden of the gorilla park, and Adrian had a little baby gorilla which he had confiscated from one of the farmers, and he was taking it into the forest every day to teach it how to eat leaves, etc. Before we realized what was happening, we were surrounded by this family group led by Casimir, the big silverback male who was the lord of that area of the forest. And I quickly set up my camera. Suddenly, this little baby gorilla called very excitedly in a way she had never done before. And the second-ranked male called Hannibal came very close to us. Some leaves parted, and he looked and he barked, and he had a very, very serious expression on his face. You had the feeling where he said, "This doesn't belong to you." And then suddenly there was this enormous barking call in the background, and Hannibal retreated, got out of the way. Casimir charged. The leaves were just exploding in front of him, and he stopped about 6 feet dead in front of Adrian, and he just screamed at him again, and Adrian realized that he had to drop this gorilla. So he dropped it on the ground. Casimir charged him again with absolutely terrifying screams and barks, and Casimir immediately stormed up to him. He took his big fist and he grabbed this little gorilla and he put it up to his shoulder. And then the incredible thing happened. He then went back towards a hole which he had made in the vegetation when he came. And in the meantime, all the family had gathered just in that little opening. And he gave the little baby gorilla to those females, and they all came around and they took it and they scratched it with their fingers, and they made sort of really lovely little noises. And the baby screamed that very same scream, and Casimir sort of stood and sat down and was looking at us, and he did sort of which is a sort of a noise a gorilla makes, when he says, well, it's all over, it's okay, don't worry. But I really thought this time we really had it.
Sound effects play an important part in a wildlife film. The camera teams record these for us separately. Then, when the film has been cut, the effects are individually matched to the action and then mixed together by skilled dubbing editors. Let's listen to how this is done for the sounds around an African waterhole. First, we hear the small birds. The doves and the sandgrouse. Then the fish eagle calling. Wildebeest move in the background. And finally, the zebra approach to drop. And our microphones can even go under the water. What do you think made these weird sounds? The animals who make these sounds are as much a part of our world as we are. They're the song of the humpback whale, recorded in the clear blue waters of Hawaii. When the Americans sent off their Voyager mission into outer space, they included a recording of the song of the humpback whale. Let's make sure that if someone on a distant planet ever hears that sound, the whale and all the other wonderful creatures of our world are still surviving. It's up to us.
It's just going so fast, that you just really haven't got all that much time to film it all.